Okay, we are at the time, so welcome to our ongoing Cultivating Caution series. Today we're going to focus down on Illinois. We're going to talk about our injury surveillance efforts and more on that. So we're going to take that into three parts. First, I'm going to show you what surveillance efforts are currently going on in Illinois when it comes to agriculture injuries, why we have these different surveillance efforts. I'll also go over our own homegrown effort, our news clipping surveillance system that we have, how we go about collecting this, and what are the results of this data stream that we have. Lastly, we're just going to quickly go over how does this surveillance information guide some of the prevention efforts that you see going on in your communities, your states, or nationwide. So why focus on agriculture injury surveillance? It remains here in Illinois. This data is in particular for Illinois, but it's actually mirrors what we see nationwide. Agriculture continues to be one of the deadliest industries in Illinois. So this is our latest data from 2022 or 2023, where we have 21.3 deaths per 100,000 workers. Just to make a sense of that number, if you compare that to workers overall, it's around 3 deaths per 100,000 workers. This is really the highest. Construction and transportation are somewhere between 10 to 15 deaths per 100,000 workers. So that's our number one. Number two is that unlike other industries, farming is unique, right? It's the only industry where your residence and work sites often overlap. So we get a lot more incidents, not necessarily just from workers, but also family members that live on these farms. Many of these farms are also exempt from complying with federal OSHA regulations. So OSHA cannot inspect generally, because there are some variations by state, but generally OSHA cannot inspect farms that have 10 or fewer employees and no temporary labor camp activity within 12 months. Now, when I say 10 or fewer employees, that does not include any family members. So if you are farming with your sons and daughters and your siblings, those are not considered farm employees. So in terms of surveillance efforts, the most common comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS for short. They have two efforts that they do, and they have been doing this since 1992. The first one is the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries, CFOI. And that's somebody, any of you could go online and access this and see these reports. So what they do, the CFOI, that Census for Fatal Injuries, what they are collecting is worker compensation reports, federal and state agency administrative reports, death certificates. They're basically trying to compile as accurate as possible data on how many occupational injuries occurred for each industry or for each occupation at both the state and federal level. So here in Illinois, our state departments, they look at death certificates primarily when they're investigating agricultural injuries. The second effort is the Survey of Occupational Injuries and Illnesses. So you've noticed the first one is a census, the second one is a survey. So this is a survey, means they're sending it out to a set number of individuals that across the nation, and it's generally done at the state level. So each state can send it out also. And for these surveys, they're focused on basically what OSHA has obligations or right um, to basically do citations and visits and so on. So it excludes anybody who's self-employed, any farms with 10 or fewer employees, private household workers, volunteers, federal government workers. When I met with them recently here in Illinois and I asked them, of all the surveys you send out, how many do you receive from farms? And they said they basically get 3 or 4 from farms. So you could see that in a sense it's not very representative of what we see in our farming communities. There is a new upcoming surveillance system going on at our new center, the Great Lakes Center for Farm Worker Health and Well-Being. This is based at University of Illinois Chicago. We are also here at UIUC. We help them and are part of that as well. They are actually, it's a really cool effort where they're using publicly available data sets. So they're using worker compensation claims, hospital records, emergency medical records, doctor office records, poison center reports, and also police crash reports as well. So it's this comprehensive effort that they are basically looking at all these data sets and trying to analyze how many of these injuries are actually coming from farms. And they're focused specifically on injuries because, again, we don't really have a good data set for this. And it's going to be really interesting statistics. They don't have anything publicly available yet. However, based on a preliminary look at the data sets they have, they're estimating that about 4,500 farm-related injuries happen every year in Illinois, which is 4 times more than what the BLS statistics are estimating, where I showed you earlier. One limitation of this data is that you can't really see the historical trends. A lot of this data has recently came online. For example, emergency medical services are really the latest iteration occurred in around 2016. So you can't really go back much farther than that. The next is our news clipping efforts, right? So I've told you basically we capture a lot of cases. Our limitation is, again, this is just a news clipping reports. So because it's news clipping reports, it's really only what enters the news is what we can see. That does mean that when it comes to injuries, a lot of farm injuries, we're not going to see that. We're going to see unique cases like grain entrapments or other very severe cases. We'll probably see a lot related to roadway incidents, and we'll see a considerable amount of incidents associated with fatalities. This is an example of news clippings that we received from the agency that we work with. So they're very simple news clippings. Another limitation is the amount of data. It really depends on that reporter. Does he give us the name and the age of the person and gender, or just tells us that a grain entrapment occurred without any feedback? So that is really up to the reporters. We document that and we try our best on this. Now that I showed you that limitations, I will go share with you what our results are. So this is basically the Illinois fatal incidents for around the last 24 years. You could see actually in the early part of our decade, we used to experience somewhere around 30 incidents per year. That's, by the way, the dotted orange line you see, that's like a 5-year average. Just to show you, because there's always going to be yearly variations. So just to show you what we're seeing. More recently, in the last 5 to 8 years, we've seen incidents closer to around 15 to maybe 20 incidents. So definitely there's been substantial improvement in the number of injuries we're seeing in Illinois. If you take that 2 decades of data just to look at what type of injuries we're seeing overall, you see that tractors remain the #1 source of injuries that we do see. This is followed by other roadway-related injuries. Just by the way, distinction. So if something happens to a tractor, it overturns or so on, we call it basically a tractor incident. If there's an accident on the road between a tractor and other vehicle, that's what we call roadway related. Also under roadway related, if there's an ATV incident where it was an accident between an ATV and another vehicle, it usually falls under roadway related as well. You can see our number 3 basically that we know of is grain bin injuries, followed then by farm equipment, ATVs, and so on. So this is it's a really nicer way to show you this by year. What I apply, since every year can be very different in terms of injuries, so I apply like a 5-year average on these curves, just so that you can see the general trend lines. So you can see machinery injuries, which include tractors and other farm equipment, tend to represent the majority of the incidents we see here. But there's a notable amount of grain bins, roadway-related, and ATV incidents. One thing we used to see in the past, but don't see, we rarely see these days, are animal fatalities. And these are, by the way, all fatal injuries as well. To show it for you as a percentage, because that's sometimes easier to see, you can see that machinery injuries generally represent around 50% of all injuries. And you can see grain bins has been pretty consistent across these 20 years. But the ATV incidents, we've seen them increase in the last 10 years or so. Now, another question is age, right? And given that, especially with these incidents occurring on farms, age is a really important question for us. And here in Illinois, the majority of our incidents occur to individuals that are 65 years and older. That's very unique in comparison to other occupational injury fields. We do also have incidents occurring to youth under the age of 24. We don't have we have a fair amount here, and in some areas they can be a lot higher. So historically, for grain entrapments, about a quarter of the injuries occur to adult, youth age 20 and younger. So this is also similarly our 5-year average chart, kind of to show you how it is. It's been fairly consistent with our 65 plus. That's where a lot of our injuries occur. Showing it to you as 100% incidents, you can see that our 65 plus in general represent around somewhere between 30 to 40% of all incidents. The next group there is 45 to 64. And then our under 24 are just generally around 10 to 15% of all cases we see. So that shows you basically who's impacted by all these injuries. And again, note this is only fatal injuries. It doesn't include any non-fatal injuries, which as you heard from the Great Lakes Center, they're estimating there's around 4,500 incidents of these every year. So just recent trends in farm fatalities in the last 2 years. This time I'm also including some rural incidents. So if you remember earlier on with the questions that we ask for our news clipping agency, we tell them, hey, any farm injuries or and then any fires or any ATV incidents that are occurring in rural communities. So this is in a sense what we are getting. So you could see that there's actually a significant number of ATV incidents that occur. The majority of them, we can't determine that they occur for farms. Majority are most likely just occurring in rural communities, not necessarily associated with farm work. Actually, statistically only, and I'll share later on more information on that. Statistically, we could say only 15% of incidents are working, with the vast majority we don't know. You can see tractors represent the significant amount of injuries that we have. We had 9 in 2022 and 4 in 2023. Fires, again, is another one where a lot of these incidents are rural communities, which is why I shaded them slightly different, so you realize those distinctions. And usually ATV and fire incidents, they don't fall into that earlier chart I showed you about farm fatalities. We have sometimes truck related incidents. We had the law in 2023 because we had a tanker carrying anhydrous ammonia had a major accident occur that where 5 people died, and then we have our grain bins and drownings. So now that I shared with you these statistics, the question lies on what does that look at farm levels? What does a tractor incident look like? What does all of these incidents look like? So I'm just going to start sharing with you some of these reports one by one, and then we'll talk about what this surveillance systems mean. So tractors are our number one incident. The vast majority of them are overturns, and that's what we see. Usually we get reported, though that's not the only way you can get injured by a tractor. Some we have cases where people fell off and were run over. So, for example, last year, in April last year, you had a 90-year-old tractor man driving a tractor when he was thrown off his tractor, and basically he was pinned under its wheels, and uh, he died from that, and he was discovered only later on from that. We have also incidents where people are run over while they're on the ground. We have people that are pinned by tractors, or usually by the machinery that's tied to the tractors. So these are the majority of the incidents we see when it involves tractors. Now, the next area I'll go over is grain entrapments. Grain entrapments has been really interesting. You can see these very huge variations. So you have years with 0 injuries, other years with you have 10 injuries, and sometimes even more, or fatalities. These are fatalities, remember. But it's a huge variety that we're seeing. Now, some of the incidents, for example, we had an incident that occurred in Menard County that occurred about 2 years ago, where he went to repair something in the grain bin. And as he was repairing it, he ended up getting entrapped in the grain itself. And he was partially submerged by that. He was then overwhelmed and ended up dying there. So that's an example. On the more rare cases, so this has happened last year. We had sometimes you experience grain bin collapses. So we had 2 occur in Illinois last year. And in this case, unfortunately, this person was near the grain bin. They were unloading the grain bin. The grain bin became unstable, and it resulted in basically rupturing and the grain spilling out. And in this way, it engulfed an employee, and he passed away. We have other incidents, also confined space incidents that occur in silos and manure storage as well. The next set of cases are ATV incidents, and again, I call these rural incidents because they're not all farm incidents, and it's important to make that distinction. Majority of these incidents are occurring to males. Majority of these incidents are occurring in roadways. Very few times they actually occur on farms. They do occur. And then there's not all of them are fatal, but there are a considerable amount of fatal incidents that we're seeing per year on them. And on average, we're seeing about 20 cases per year. 2020, I think, especially when COVID hit, we saw this huge spike where we had almost 50 incidents that year. Some examples is an example of just an ATV crash that occurred to the community. So a woman was driving an ATV in a rural community, and she rounded that corner too fast, and it rolled over into a roadside ditch. And basically, she was thrown off her vehicle as it rolled over, and was airlifted to the hospital. Another case are farm related. So you had 2 farm operators in Jerseyville, Illinois. They were driving on a rural road, and they were trying to turn left into the farm entrance. And then there was an SUV behind them, and that SUV saw them slowing down and attempted to pass them on the left. So as they were turning into the farm, the driver of the SUV, she was trying to pass them on the left and ended up colliding with them. So that caused the UTV to roll over, and then the driver of the UTV was killed, and the passenger was transported to the hospital. So that's another case of incidents that we do see and we document there. Another thing we don't see it every year, but when we do see it, it involves a lot of people. That's anhydrous ammonia incidents. So we have basically, so for example, we have two cases. The first case that occurred really actually happened in Chicago. There was a person driving a tractor with an anhydrous ammonia tank behind him. Something happened to the valve where basically it was leaking anhydrous ammonia, and when he found out, he stopped and called basically emergency services to help deal with that. And basically, once that happened, it kind of plumed into the air, and it sent 37 people to the hospitals. Nobody was fatally injured in this case. Another incident occurred was basically a truck was carrying around 7,500 gallons of anhydrous ammonia, and they were actually driving on a local highway when they got involved into a collision, and that tank basically got punctured, releasing a lot of anhydrous ammonia. So 5 people ended up being killed from this, and they had to evacuate over 500 people from that community due to the ammonia leak. The next type of cases that we see is farm cases. And again, similarly to ATVs, these are not necessarily just in general the farm fires. Well, in these cases, we've focused on only two types. There's a lot more rural fires, but here we try to capture only two types of fires. We did confined space fires and farm machinery fires. So some examples we have for two incidents we had is for a confined space fire, we had basically a 10,000 gallon propane tank that was supplying gas to a hog unit. And at some point on the line, it caught fire. And so they had to basically immediately go and try to deal with this fire. Eventually, they were able to shut off the propane and they were able to handle this fire. There was nobody was injured, but they did basically evacuate nearby because they didn't know, right? This 10,000 gallon propane tank could have easily exploded and it would have caused a lot of damage there. Another incident was a combine fire. So you had a farmer, he went basically was harvesting, and as he's harvesting, there was a lot of wind going on there, and the harvest was drier than usual. And he didn't notice. He just noticed that he felt like there's a lot of wind moving on around him. And his cooperator, his farm manager, basically tagged him and stopped him. And then that's when, and highlighting, hey, the back of the combine was on fire. So they immediately turned it off. They disassembled the grain wagon, pushed it away while they're calling the fire department. And they took care of it, and luckily that fire did not spread, and only the combine was burned out. But that could have easily been a more severe incident. So now that we went through all of this, so how does this information guide our prevention initiatives here that we're doing at Illinois and other states as well? So I would say the most important aspect is that it kind of creates new emphasis areas, right? So grain entrapments, Purdue University has been documenting them since the 1980s or so on, and there's been movements on them. But especially more recently in 2010, when you had a huge spike of number of injuries, it became like a kind of like a focus area to basically resolve and deal with, in a sense. So you have grain safety coalition that started here in Illinois with contributions from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, And then from Purdue, they started the Ag Confined Spaces trainings, set of trainings as well. So that's an example of how this surveillance allows us to respond in real time to what we're seeing on our farming communities. Another thing, it allows us to track progress. So you can look at, for example, grain entrapments. They peaked in 2010, and that's when we saw that there's a lot of initiatives to address that. And you can see right after that it dipped, and now it's slightly lower than what we've seen, but it's back on the rise again. So it allows us to see how our training programs are going, how are they improving, what can we do more to continue to control or reduce the number of incidents that we're seeing. Another thing is that, again, combining both of those information together that we talked about earlier, is that we can target specific demographics. So this comes from Marchfield Clinic. They have a center focused on just agricultural youth-related injuries, and they've been tracking this every year. And they send out these fact sheets every year or so, where they're reporting on how many children are injured, what does the child population look like in farming communities, and it kind of helps us think of what kind of programs do we need for our youth and children. So you see a lot in response to the number of youth injuries we see. There's been, you have progressive ag safety days, and you have other youth-focused safety days, either on farms or in schools and so on. And lastly, that leads me to the last point. It allows us to conduct programs, right? It puts a focus areas on where should we focus our training events, our programming. For example, cultivating caution. A lot of the series that you've got to hear throughout the year has been based off some of the surveillance programs either we've done here locally in Illinois or nationally done as well. Also, it's a means of securing funding, right? We can show that there is a problem in this particular area that we need to address. For example, OSHA Harwood program. It's a grant program conducted by OSHA. They've contributed about $5 million since 2008 just for grain entrapment related issues. So in conclusion, and I purposely decided to keep this short, hopefully we'll have more interactions from our guests. The top 3 types of fatal injuries in Illinois currently are tractor-related injuries, roadway-related injuries, and grain bins, with a special mention for ATVs, which also belongs there, but it's a lot harder to classify. Around half of the fatal injuries in Illinois are machinery related, and around 35% of the victims are elderly in our communities. And that, in a sense, is an important thing for us as we build these training programs. In terms of just surveillance, it's an important resource, right? It provides us new focus areas, supports funding for new programs, and allows us to monitor the progress that we see here locally or nationally. And news clipping services, which is what I shared with you, is also an important source for tracking agriculture injuries. It allows us to track significant events that are occurring in rural communities and gives us a glimpse in the agriculture injuries, right? So we find it representative at the fatality level, but vast underestimation at the non-fatal level, which is why even though I do collect non-fatal levels, unless I'm talking about a specific type of incidents like ATVs or fires or grain entrapments, I usually don't share the non-fatal injuries. Yeah, and so limitations, as I mentioned, as there's a lack of central reporting given the exemption clause, which is why we have to establish surveillance systems to track agriculture-related injuries in Illinois and in other states as well. And I will end it right here. Again, special thanks to all our Farm Doc sponsors for making this happen. I really appreciate being able to do this month in, month out, and I'm excited for new opportunities as well. And then a thank you for the Farm Doc educational partners. Whether they help in developing, promoting, or advertising, or with the programs themselves. And then thank you for joining us. Please, as a reminder, all of these videos are available at Farm Doc Daily. If you have any questions or you want to comment on anything, I'd really appreciate that. To have a discussion, and don't forget to do the survey.